Good morning and welcome to the joint committee with the House Appropriations and the Senate Ways and Means. First, I would like to make an announcement that Senator Renee Erickson is replacing the Senate President Ty Masterson for today's meeting. So welcome to committee, Senator Erickson. We're going to be diving into some of the fiscal matters for the state. First, I want to say that I hope the governor is recovering well. As everybody knows, she was diagnosed with COVID-19, and so I'm hoping and wishing the best for her. But we're going to go ahead and move forward with the budget proposal from her office. So first, we're going to have the Fall Human Services Consensus caseloads. And so I'd ask the senior fiscal analyst with legislative research, Megan Leopold, to give us a briefing. Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. I'll be presenting on the Fall Human Services caseload estimates. These are estimates for the Human Services Entitlement Programs, which are the state programs that are required by the federal government to serve anyone who meets the requirement or the eligibility requirements. These are Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF cash assistance in DCF, foster care in DCF, and Care Medical, which expands across both KDHE and KDADS. The estimating team meets twice a year, April and October. We last met on October 24th. And we, at that time, made revised estimates for fiscal year 23, and we created new estimates for fiscal year 24. The starting point for our budget, or for our estimates, was the budget that was approved by the 2022 Legislature in Senate Bill 267 and House Bill 2510. And we also made adjustments for funds that were reappropriated from fiscal year 22 into fiscal year 23. For fiscal year 23, the revised estimate for all human services caseloads is $4.8 billion for all funds, and that includes $1.3 billion SGF. This is an all funds increase of $260 million and an SGF decrease of $198 million. For TANF cash assistance, the estimate is $10 million all funds. This is a decrease of $750,000 below the approved amount. And that's really due to a continuing decline that we're seeing in the TANF caseloads since about 2015. In foster care, the estimate is $281 million. That includes $193 SGF. This is an increase of $9 million and including $5.4 million SGF. This is due to an increase that are in the number of children that are in higher cost facilities, as well as an increase in the daily rate that's been paid to those facilities. For Care Medical, which again spans across KDHE and KDAD's budgets, the 2023 estimate is $4.4 billion, and that includes $1.1 billion SGF. This is an increase of $254 million. It includes a decrease of $200 million SGF. That all funds increase is largely due to changes to the Healthcare Access Improvement Program, or HCAP. This is an assessment that's paid by hospitals and used to draw down enhanced federal funds that are then redispersed out to the hospitals with the goal of increasing access for underinsured Kansans. If you'll remember, the 2020 Legislature passed legislation that raised the provider assessment from 1.83% tax on inpatient revenues to a 3% tax on inpatient and outpatient revenues. These changes required the approval of CMS. That was recently approved, and so this program became, or these new rates became active July 1st of 2023. So these new rates were anticipated to bring an additional $240 million federal dollars into the state for fiscal year 23. The increase in all funds was partially offset by $58 million in reappropriations that were carried over from fiscal year 22, as well as population growth estimates that were below those that we estimated in the spring. The SGF decrease that we see in fiscal year 23 is largely due to that 6.2% increase to the federal match that is part of the public health emergency for COVID-19. This 6.2 increase was included in one quarter for fiscal year 23 in our April estimates. Since then, it's been extended, and then these estimates, it's included in 3 quarters of fiscal year 23. So that brings down the required state share, which is why you see that SGF continuing to go down in fiscal year 23. The 3 quarters of the enhanced FMAP in fiscal year 23 raised that federal match from its base of 59.86% to 64.51%. And this is expected to decrease the required state share of Medicaid expenditures by approximately $182 million in fiscal year 23. Since we've created the memo and had our October estimates, we've learned some new information about the FMAP. Originally, the legislation that created it paired it with the public health emergency so that the increased federal match would continue through the end of the public health emergency. However, the omnibus bill that was signed by the federal government in December decouples that FMAP from the public health emergency and instead lays out a phased down approach. So for fiscal year 23, we now know that there will be a 5% FMAP increase in the last quarter, whereas in our estimates, we did not include any enhanced federal match. So these changes will be figured into our final estimates that we'll do in April for fiscal year 23. Lastly, for fiscal year 23, KDAD's non-can care is a $91 million, and that includes $45 million SGF. This is a decrease of $2.4 million and includes $4.0 million SGF. These are largely due to lower than anticipated costs for nursing facility for mental health fee-for-service payments and expenditures for certain waiver assessments. Moving on to fiscal year 24, the revised human services caseload estimate for fiscal year 24 is $4.8 billion all funds. That includes $1.5 billion state general fund. This is an all funds increase of $7.9 million or 0.2% and includes an increase of $163 million SGF or 12.6%. And that is above the estimates for fiscal year 23. For temporary assistance for needy families cash assistance for 2024, the estimated cost is $9.8 million, and that's all federal funds. This is a decrease of $150,000 below the revised 2023 revised estimate. The current projections are continuing to show a slowing rate of decrease in the TANF caseloads, but we're still seeing that decrease. For foster care for 2024, the estimated cost is $280 million. That includes $195 SGF. This is a decrease of $1 million all funds and an SGF increase of $2 million. While the total number of children in foster care is expected to continue to decrease, the daily rate paid to child placing agencies is estimated to increase. For CanCare Medical 2024, the estimate is $4.4 billion all funds. This includes $1.2 billion SGF. This is an SGF increase of $154 million, but it's no change in the all funds amount for fiscal year 2023 from the fiscal year 2023 revised estimate. While the all funds number didn't change, there were some shifts. The first is that capitation rates are anticipated to decline steadily throughout 2024. During the public health emergency, as a stipulation for accepting the enhanced federal match, there is a requirement of continuous eligibility in Medicaid. This required that no one could be removed from Medicaid unless they met certain requirements. This is now expected to end in April. So we expect that starting in April, which is the last quarter of fiscal year 23, the agency will begin to do regular redeterminations, and we'll see that membership of Medicaid drop over the course of about 12 months. KDHE estimates that anywhere between 100,000 and 125,000 beneficiaries will be removed from Medicaid over the course of that 12 months. And for reference, the fiscal year 23 average beneficiaries so far is approximately 457,000. Offsetting the population decreases are expenditures that are related to the ongoing transition of community mental health centers to certified community behavioral health clinics, or CCBHCs. The 2024 estimates include 70 million all funds and 27 million SGF related to the transition of CMHCs to CCBHCs. Also offsetting that population decrease in fiscal year 24 are estimates to include an increase related to the 5% rebase of nursing facilities. The additional information that we've learned about the FMAP from the recent federal omnibus bill that will impact fiscal year 24 is that phase down approach. We now anticipate that there will be a 2.5% FMAP or federal match increase in the first quarter of fiscal year 2024 and a 1.5% increase in quarter 2 of fiscal year 24. These, again, were not factored into these estimates because that was not the law at the time. So the SGF increase that we see in fiscal year 24, given the new information, we would expect it to drop. But at this point, it's due to the end of that, the anticipated end at the time of our estimates of that enhanced federal match that was not included in any of the quarters in fiscal year 24. The base FMAP for fiscal year 2024 without any of the enhanced FMAP is 60.67%. And again, this will be figured into the estimates that we do in April revising fiscal year 24. Lastly, KDAD's non-can care, the estimate is 100 million, and that includes 52 million SGF. This is an increase of 9 million, including 7 million SGF, and that is primarily due to increased growth in the PACE program. I'm happy to stand for any questions.
All right, thank you, Megan. The first question that I have, and actually you kind of touched on this, but I wonder if you can elaborate about the enhanced FMAP in regards to what the federal government has been paying in regards to Medicaid during the public health emergency. And obviously, when the consensus revenue estimate group met in November, we did not know that the passage of the omnibus bill by Congress was going to decouple the enhanced FMAP from the public health emergency, which obviously has happened. And so can you go through in fiscal year, or actually calendar year 2023, what the percentage is going to be and how that is going to be decreased as the calendar year progresses?
Yes. So the first quarter of calendar year fiscal year 23 will be a 6.2% increase. The following quarter will be 5%, followed by 2.5% and 1.5%.
All right. So thank you for elaborating on that, because we need to be, we need to understand that that enhanced FMAP is going to be gone by the end of calendar year 2023. And so the profiles that we had in November actually, correct me if I'm wrong, had the 6.2% factored in the first quarter, but we also anticipated that the public health emergency might have not been extended, which at that point was contingent on the enhanced FMAP.
The estimates that we've created for fiscal year 24 did not include an enhanced FMAP in any of the quarters. And for fiscal year 23, we included it only through the third quarter.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that in the profiles that we have and we've been sharing with the legislators is that even though that decoupling of the enhanced FMAP, it probably won't affect the profiles that we've already been sharing around. Do we have any questions for Megan? All right, you did a very thorough job and nobody has any questions. Thank you. Next, we're going to have the overview of the fall 2022 consensus revenue estimates. And so I would ask the Director of the Legislative Research, J.G. Scott, to approach the committee. Welcome to committee, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. Just going to talk about a few things real quick. want to just do a little bit of a context of where we were and where we are now. A summary of the consensus revenue estimates, a very brief profile, and then I just want to talk just a moment about the December receipts. For context, in April of 2022, we increased the estimate from November of 21 by $411 million. Individual income 140, corporate 125, sales tax 75, compensating use 30. Then we received the actual receipts, and we were $438 million above that estimate. Once again, income tax was like 336 million up, corp 81. And then kind of looking at that time frame, right before we did the estimates, our October receipts were up about 308 million. So that kind of brings us to the consensus revenue estimates. For the estimates in FY 2023, we increased the estimates by $794 million.
Representative Ballard.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I'm trying to follow, but where are we, please? I apologize for asking.
I just wanted to go over a quick little context of where we were. That wasn't in your packet. We're now on the consensus revenue estimates.
Thank you very much. Just a clarification. Thank you.
All right, continue, JG.
The 23 estimates, we increased $794 million. It was about an 8.9% increase. Going back to our April estimates, we would be increasing about $300 million in taxes only above our actual receipts for 2022. For 2024, our total receipts estimates is $10,124 million. It's an increase of about $423 million, or 4.4% above the 23 estimate. What we really talked about a lot during the consensus revenue estimates was inflationary aspect and how that drives receipts in the present immediate future, but creates a lot of uncertainty and possible pullback or downturn in the economy in the longer run. 22 has had the highest levels of inflation in several decades, and the sharpest monetary response to inflation during that same time frame. Inflation, as we talked about, really does push up those nominal receipts, but that does help with the purchase of sales taxable items going up because inflation is going up. Rates of pay are going up, so withholding is going up, and income tax receipts. So the larger impact, though, in those longer terms is much less certain. The Fed's increased interest rates pretty dramatic, and eventually that is going to show a lot of cooling in the economy. So when we were looking at this, at these projections, we were, I would say, cautiously optimistic about where it's going as far as these projections go. We still have them going up, so we have them increasing in those out years. Inflation, previously we had estimated inflation at 4.6. For 22, we now have that at 8.5, an increase of 3.9. Real GDP, that would be nominal minus inflation, at 1.3, which is down from the previous 2.7. It was a reduction of 1.4%. GDP, Kansas nominal GDP, we had at 9.8, an increase above the 7.2%, of an increase of about 2.6%. For 23, we had previously estimated inflation at 3%. We increased that to 5%, an increase of 2%. Real Kansas GDP, we dropped that from the previous 2.3% to 1.1%, a decrease of 1.2%. And then nominal Kansas GDP, we had originally estimated at 5.2%. Now we have that at 6.1%, an increase of 0.9%. And Kansas is pretty comparable to the U.S. average in most all of those areas. Talk a little bit about employment. Kansas job market continues to be exceptionally tight. We have more job openings than we have available unemployed people. It's the all-time low level in recent months. Right now, we have one unemployed individual for every 2.5 job openings. That was as of the time we were doing these estimates. So 2.5 openings for every one unemployed person. Consequently, Kansas had problems re-adding some of the jobs that were lost during the pandemic. 82.6% of all jobs and almost 88% of the private sector jobs regained is what we've done so far as of September 22. The unemployment rate does continue to be low, close to all-time lows. It's been under 3% for over a year. The forecast unemployment rate for 23 is 3.5% and 3.6% for 24. Both of those numbers are pretty consistent with what people classify as full employment. The ag sector, it currently faces some heavy headwinds, inflationary pressures for ag production. Input costs have been growing even higher than the economy at large, so it's getting more expensive. We've had persistent drought conditions, which has limited some of the farmers' ability to take advantage of those relatively higher commodity prices that we're seeing. But like I said, the input cost of those is really creating some problems for some of our farmers. The Kansas exports, though, are a bright spot as they're projected to exceed $5 billion for the second time ever. Kansas farmers are projected to have a positive net income for 22, but it's expected to be lower than both 2021 and then those long-term averages as well. Oil and gas, we did see a spike in gas and energy prices over the summer, but they've kind of settled back down again. The Kansas crude oil, we forecasted at $78 a barrel for 23, and then dropping to $65 a barrel for 24. For 23, we had previously had it at 77, so it's a small increase. It does estimate smaller declines in oil production. We're expecting 28 million barrels in 23 and 27.5 in 24. Natural gas prices, we have increased to $5.50 per MCF in 23 and $4 dropping slightly in 24. Some of the items that we did include in our estimates, we did include all of the enacted legislation. The largest is the food sales tax reduction from 6.5% to 4% on January of 23. and then down to 2% in 2024. That would be approximately $84 million in 23 and $270 million in 24. The estimate also has the 0.5% decrease in corporate income tax. That would be attributable to the Apex legislation. And in 24, that was estimated at $25 million. It would be for half of the fiscal year. We also incorporated reductions of $104 million over the 2 fiscal years for the Apex project itself. So if we want to go to page 10, table 2, you'll see all of the adjustments that were made for 2023 from our previous estimate adjusted for legislation. So individual income tax, we increased $438.4 million, 9.4%. Corporate, we have it increasing at $123 million. Sales and use, about $190 million for, or $190 million for sales, and 6.3 for compensating use. And you'll see that the total receipts, we did increase the $794.2 million that we had talked about earlier. For 2024 on page 9, we show the original estimates. These are the first time we've estimated 2024. Individual income tax, we have estimated going up about $202 million, about 4%. Corporate, we have it decreasing by about $127 million. And remember that that does include the corporate reduction of 0.5% and the Apex project being implemented. Sales tax, we have flat with 2023. And also remember that that has the $270 million reduction for the food sales tax. So overall, we have taxes only going from almost 10.1 billion to almost 10.2 billion. It's up about $94.9 million, about 0.9%. If we look in other taxes, you'll see a rather large increase from 112 to 205 million in interest. Interest rates are going up substantially. It's more than the $500,000 we had projected a few years ago. But with higher interest rates, we're also having higher balances. So that is going up. Transfers, we have transfers being adjusted by about 250 million. And want people to also remember that we had a $270 million one-time payment in 23 for capers. So overall, you'll see the total receipts going up $423 million from 9.7 to 10.1 million in receipts. Do you want me to stop for some questions, or would you rather go ahead and talk about the profile real quick?
Committee, are there any questions for JG? Senator Billinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. JG, thank you for being here today. First off, on the employment, you dropped way off in 20, and what is the number for this last year for 22?
For 22, we had it about 2.6%.
Because I read somewhere where we lost 700-800 people last year in population, the state.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I said, I read somewhere where it said we had lost population in the state of Kansas in 2022, like 800 people. Is that right?
I don't recall the exact number, but yeah, I've read that the population had been reduced.
Okay. And then the other question I guess I'd have is, how concerned are you with your projections on individual income tax, seeing that it did drop in December?
With right, well, we'll take a look at all of these again in April, but with the inflation up as it has been, and with wages increasing, I mean, we're still seeing some inflationary increases in services, which are mainly tied to a lot of wages. So one of the bigger drivers in there is is withholding, and we're still continuing to see it pretty strong. We'll talk a little bit more about income tax in just a little bit with corporate as well.
Right. And we also seen a drop in sales tax. And I've also read where, people during the pandemic had large savings, people that weren't out spending money, and that's pretty much gone at this point in time.
Once again, though, we do believe that the one-time money from the federal government inputs, I think, is starting to be reduced. But inflation is also going up, and that's going to affect those sales tax receipts as well. So we think that it's going to be pretty close. I mean, we're not really concerned about it just yet. A few more months, we may be looking at this more closely. But yeah, we'll look at all those things when we do our review for the consensus estimates in April.
Thank you.
Any further questions for JG? Actually, I have a question, and then Representative Tarwater. So going back to the oil and gas industry, you know that I always ask this question. In November, we had speculated that it was going to be $78 a barrel. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you mention it going down, and what was the dollar amount?
We had it dropping in 24 to $65 a barrel.
65. Okay, that's why I thought you said. I just wanted to make sure that I heard that right, because right now the Kansas Common is trading at $67.75, and so I just wanted to make sure that we are speculating that correctly.
Yeah.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is, this was created on November 9th. The estimates were. Can you tell me? You probably didn't have October actual receipts in by then. So October, November, and maybe December. Are we tracking?
We did have October receipts, and those were up substantially from what our previous estimates were.
In November?
November, we did not have yet.
So, I mean, we do now, right? So
Correct.
Were they on target?
We were slightly low in October, and but fairly close in October and November. December, we had a spike, but we'll talk about that in just a moment.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions for JG? Senator Pittman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, JG. Do you ever produce any kind of range of confidence on some of these when we have these variables like the inflation rate, the unemployment rate, and kind of come up with an over-under with a range of confidence of some sort? Because we're dealing with uncertainty here, and we're trying to make some long-term decisions, but we keep hearing the word uncertainty here.
If we were looking at uncertainty right now, it would be pretty broad. It could be substantially higher. I mean, it could be substantially lower. We just did what we thought was going to be as close as we could get to, but no, we didn't talk about a range of possibilities.
Any other further questions? All right, not seeing any. JG, you may proceed.
If we want to take a look at the profile real quick, it's for 2022 through 2024. And you should really study this pretty close because this is going to be good for 10 minutes. But what we had projected after we did the consensus revenue estimates, we had a $2.3 billion ending. Yeah, that's a $1 billion ending balance, with about a little over $980 million in the rainy day fund. For 24, we took that ending balance, added the amount that we had estimated for consensus revenue estimates. Our expenditures, we had adjusted for the reappropriations, money that was not spent in 22, went into 23, able to be spent in 23, is not going to be available in 24. We added it in 23, subtracted it in 24, added human services caseloads as Megan had talked about, and we estimated the school finance to come up with expenditures of about $9.2 billion and an ending balance of $3.2 billion. And once again, that does leave the budget stabilization fund, the rainy day fund, alone. So for 24, originally we were anticipating bringing in about 934 million more than we were spending. Do you want to quantify that is no other adjustments for expenditures that would be adjusted for inflation or any other items that come up? So that's a really a bottom line number.
And as you said, this is only going to be valid for a few minutes because we're going to have the director of budget come with the governor's budget, and that's going to probably alter some of the information that we have on the profile.
I would say all of it.
I don't know about all of it. Are there any questions for JG in regards to profile? Representative Landwehr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess I'm not understanding the human services caseload or the school finance numbers for 23.
The school finance is, we met in November to estimate what those were going to be. And we had a total increase of about 225 million. A portion of that is we paid down the one-time delay of about $170 million. So that was added back in because it's a top line, the 9,171. I had deleted that as a one-time payment. So overall, we have caseload or school finance going up about $225 million. And that's mainly around more students and then once again backfilling that about $170 million one-time payment from 24. And we also for 24 increased the base rate from 4,846 to 5,006. We had estimated an increase of 5.3%. That's the first year that we do the 3-year average of the Midwest CPI-U. So the base rate went up 5.3%.
Representative Landwehr.
Thank you.
Any other further questions for JG? All right, I'm not.
And then one last thing
Yes.
I just want to mention, going on to what Representative Tarwater was talking about. For our December receipts, we had those going up $110 million above the estimate. But there's a huge flashing caution sign. Corporate was up about 150 million for the year, though about 130 million of that right now we are estimating to be caused by the Salt Parity Act. That was passed in 22, House Bill 2239. And what it does is it allows taxes that would otherwise be paid by individuals to be paid by business entities. And then the individual owners would receive a tax credit equal to the amount paid. So it's just flipping the money that would be paid through in income tax into corporate receipts. So it's dollar for dollar credit. So we would anticipate seeing a $130 million reduction in individual income taxes. So while we're talking about $110 million in above estimates in December, looking at it more realistically, we would say probably pretty close to zero, plus or minus, $10, $20 million for that. But that was not calculated in as much as actually had happened in those shifts because of salt.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, JG, for your presentation. And we're going to go ahead and move on to probably the most interesting item that we have this morning and what everybody has been waiting for. And that is going to be the governor's budget recommendations. So I would invite the director of the Division of Budget, Adam Proffitt. Director Proffitt. All right, Director Proffitt, are you ready?
I think I am. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And while that's being passed around, I'll take this opportunity to inform the committee that in DC, they provide the conferees a table and a chair and water and everything. So maybe in next year's budget, there'll be money for that here as well. Not this year, next year. So thank you very much for inviting me over here. My name is Adam Proffitt, Director of the Budget. I appreciate the committee's time. Also, the committee's willingness to be flexible and meet as a joint committee. It's always helpful, I think, for you all to hear from me just one time. So I'm not mixing the message across two committees. So thank you very much for the flexibility, both to the chairs and also to the committee. As we start to move forward through this budget presentation, I'm hopeful that it'll be received more warmly than my front door received me this morning as I walked out. We've got a very good budget that we're going to walk through. I imagine I'll talk for about 45 minutes, which should take us to the top of the hour, and we'll be done with no time for questions. Before we jump into the actual budget, I did want to note that the BLS, the feds did release their most recent inflation, the CPI numbers this morning at about 7:30. Kind of some mixed news in there, some good news, some bad news, depending on what level you're looking at and what you're most interested in. Headline inflation was 6.5% on an annual basis, which is quite a bit lower than it's been the past couple of months, still in the historically high range. What I track and have been tracking over this past year more closely is the month-to-month build, is the inflation going up or down. The month-over-month build was actually a negative 0.1%, which means that prices actually dropped 0.1% month-to-month, which is the direction you want to be going. That's at the headline level. We'll get more into this in just a little bit, but when you look at some of the details, you'll notice that food at home, which is known as groceries, saw an 11.8% annual inflation rate this month, and it actually grew month to month by 0.2%. So overall prices are coming down by 0.1% month to month, but groceries are still costing more on a month-to-month basis. So just want to make sure that that information is out there. So as we're moving through the agenda, I just want to make sure that we take a moment to look at where we've come from and then where we're at today and then where we're going. I think it's important to make sure that we're grounded in that as we talk about what this budget means for the future. And to that end, my staff absolutely hates this, but I start every staff meeting with a success story. I think it's important to celebrate successes and recognize things that you've done so you're not just buried in the go, go, go. So on the where we were, I wanted to make sure that we celebrated successes. Because what you see on this piece of paper is absolutely a success, and it is born of partnership between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And the governor wants to make sure that she extends her gratitude to the legislature for all the partnership that's happened over the past several years to get the budget to where it is today. So what we've done is listed out some key highlights of what's been accomplished over the past couple of years. You can see that we closed the bank of KDOT. We're fully funding schools. You heard JG and Dr. Leopold talking about the extra one-time payment to K-12 to get them caught up and on schedule. We've retired nearly $2 billion worth of debt over the past couple of years, if you include the Capers deposit. So a lot of debt coming off the books, eliminated the PMI bridge loan. We haven't had a certificate of indebtedness for the past 2 years. That's a tool to help us manage cash flow throughout the year. We haven't needed that for 2 years. So just want to make sure we celebrate that success together before we get going. So moving on to page 4 here in terms of where we are, JG just gave a very nice overview of revenues. I just want to make sure we put our revenue forecast in here. You'll see a couple of orange boxes circling some numbers. Those are important. They'll become more important in subsequent slides, but the top orange box is around retail sales. You'll see that in fiscal 23, we only forecasted a 1.1% growth over fiscal 22. And then fiscal 24, we had flat growth from 24 over 23. And that's because we have already baked in the forecast of the current food sales tax reduction. Again, the current law shows that food sales tax came down to 4% starting January 1st. We'll go down to 2% next year, January 1, 2024, and then it'll eventually eliminate to 0 by 2025. That's already been baked into the revenue forecast current law, and that's going to be important here in a couple of slides, but want to make sure I pointed that out. So where we're going, this is what everybody wants to hear this morning. This budget has something for everybody. There are investments in early childhood all the way through retirement. There are investments for all 4 corners of the state and for all Kansans. The base spending, I want to point out, is less than the percentage increase in base spending is less than half of what the inflation rate is. So we wanted to be very mindful on base spending increases, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. There's some targeted and sustainable tax relief for all Kansans. There is another focus on one-time expenses. That seemed to be the buzzword of last session, one-time expenditures. We wanted to make sure that we continued that this year. There is a large budget surplus, but we'll talk in a bit about why we wanted to focus, why the governor is focused on one-time expenditures. There's further deposits into the stabilization fund. And then looking at out-year structural balance, making sure that we're protecting resources across the horizon. This is going to be the key and kind of the theme of this budget is looking across the horizon to ensure that we have the resources available to meet the needs of Kansans for years to come. Some of the considerations that went into building this budget, we did some stress testing to safeguard against potential future macroeconomic headwinds. I think Senator Pittman asked the question of JG, are there ranges of confidence? We're not going to get in a range of confidence, but we did do some modeling. Specifically, there was a report by a national firm put out this summer that looked at all 50 states and what their current cash position is. And if we were to enter into a recession, what the potential cash revenue hit would be to that state, both on reduced revenues and increased expenditures in some of the entitlement programs. It's a national study. It doesn't understand everybody's nuanced budgets, but it's a good barometer, right? And it showed that if there was a steep recession in Kansas or mild to steep, it'd be about $1.5 to $1.7 billion of revenue hit over a 12 to 18 month period. It is not forecasting that for Kansas. It was just saying, here is a stress test you can put into your budget as you built that. So we looked at those out years, looked all the way through 27 to make sure that there was resources across the horizon to make sure that we can take care of things. Again, minimizing the addition of new base expenditures and trying to avoid where we could with the information we knew at the time, any duplication with the SPARK process. SPARK, as you know, has approved buckets of funding, so we focus on other buckets of government as the governor was building the budget here. So we'll dive into the details here. If we move to page 7, talk about sustainable tax relief. The governor has proposed 3 separate tax policies. There will be 3 separate bills that'll be introduced, well, 6, 3 in each chamber. So those bills are not a part of this budget, but we did reserve for the loss in revenue within this budget to ensure that that was accounted for in the ending profile. So the 3 that are out there are pulling forward the effective date of the full elimination of the state level sales tax on food. Again, right now we have another 2 years to go before the state level sales tax on food goes to 0%. She wants to pull that forward to this year, and we'll talk about how we're going to cover that here in a little bit. She also wants to include diapers and feminine hygiene products into that category of exemption from state level sales tax. The addition of a 4-day back to school sales tax holiday, and then also increasing the exemption on Social Security income tax such that we can smooth the cliff that's out there. So let's dive into the details on each of these proposals if we could. Moving on to page 8. So the first one that the governor is proposing and has been talking about for some time, again, is pulling forward the start date of the full elimination of the state level sales tax on food. So January 1st, 2023, the tax went down to 4%, which is a huge step. It was 6.5%, so that's a substantial savings going from 6.5 to 4. But even at 4%, Kansas remains among the highest sales tax rates on groceries in all of America. And in fact, if you look at the population by county and just add up all the numbers, 37% of Kansans live in a county that directly borders a state that has a lower food sales tax rate than Kansas does. That is true today, and that'll be true next year when we go to 2%. So it'll be true for the next 2 years under the current law. 37% of Kansans live right next to a state with a lower food sales tax than what Kansas has on the books today. We talked about inflation as I opened up the presentation. Groceries have seen double-digit inflation rates, annual inflation rates. This says for 9 straight months. Given the news that came out this morning, that's 10 straight months. The food prices have gone up across the nation and certainly in Kansas. I also talked about the current law already being baked into the out-year revenue forecast for fiscal 23 and 24. So effectively, by pulling forward the start date to 4/1/23, that's a one-time revenue hit. You guys have already agreed to the ongoing revenue reduction in the out years. That policy is set. So to pull that forward, all we have to do is use our current surplus to cover the revenue loss between 4/1/23 and 1/1/25. And you'll see when we get to the end of this presentation what our ending balance is, that we have the revenues, the surplus, to cover that one-time revenue loss. So the governor is very much interested in partnering with this body here to pull that forward to 4/1/23. That would be the next time that we could pull it forward. We have to start at the beginning of a quarter. Moving on to the next sales tax proposal, again, the addition of a 4-day back-to-school sales tax holiday. This is something that is relatively popular in different states across America, and it doesn't really matter what the demographics or the political leanings are. It's a lot of states do this. Missouri, to our east, being the closest state to us that does this. She would like to start this August in 2023 an annual back-to-school sales tax holiday. So not just a one-year deal, but put this into law such that this happens every single year going forward. It would be for 4 days. It would be for select and identified back-to-school type items. Think clothing, think electronic equipment, think pens and pencils, stuff like that. This would provide about $5 million of tax relief to parents as they're heading into back-to-school time, and also to teachers, because we know that teachers also purchase a lot of items for their classrooms. It also is a tool for our businesses and border communities to remain competitive. If you live in the Kansas City area, which is where I live, if you walk into any mall or shopping center on the Kansas side, on the weekend that Missouri has theirs in place, the Kansas stores are pretty empty. You drive about 5 miles east to a store in Missouri and they're pretty full. So those businesses are getting the benefit of that sales tax holiday and getting that business. We'd like to have that back over here in Kansas. One key provision about the bill that the governor will be introducing, or that will be introduced hopefully this week, is that this proposal is compliant with the streamlined sales tax agreement. So there's no concerns with that. It's clean, it's ready to go, it's ready to implement. We can get this up and running by August of this year. Moving forward on to slide 10, the final of the proposals is the elimination of the cliff on Social Security income tax in Kansas. This is far and away the most complex to understand and certainly to try to articulate, so I'll do my best here. So under current Kansas law, for any tax filer that has $75,000 or less in federal adjusted gross income, all of their reportable Social Security income is exempt from state income tax, right? It's actually a subtraction modification. So whatever your federal adjusted gross income is on your federal return, take that number, that goes on to line 1 of your Kansas return. If you're $75,000 or less, you subtract the entirety of your Social Security income, therefore it's not taxable. So for example, if a citizen had $75,000 in total income and $20,000 of that was Social Security income that's reportable, line 1 on their Kansas return shows $75,000 because that's their adjusted gross income, and they would subtract $20,000 because that's the subtraction modification of Social Security. Now their starting point is $55,000 for their state taxes. Under current law, if that same taxpayer got a $5 raise throughout the year, their cost of living adjustment pushed them upwards by $5. Now they're making $75,005 federal adjusted gross income. Again, that goes on line 1 of your Kansas return. But because you're over $75,000, we do not subtract that $20,000 in Social Security income. So you're paying taxes on $75,005 instead of $50,005. So the net impact is that taxpayers, if they earn $1 more, could see a tax bill of $1,400, $1,500, $2,000, and that's just not quite right. So what the governor is proposing is not a new idea, but she wants to put it forward in this budget. That's the smoothing out of the cliff such that taxpayers only pay incrementally more state income tax on the Social Security between $75,000 and $100,000. And I won't get into the formula, but in effect, if you make 10% more than the $75,000, effectively 10% of your Social Security income tax would be subject to state income tax. Same with if you make 20% more, all the way up to $100,000. Once you're at $100,000, you're just paying the full freight of the state income tax on $100,000 on everything that you've earned from there. The impact that we anticipate here is about $21 million in the first year, and then it'll be about $19 million in subsequent years. So that's a direct savings to the impacted retirees. So moving to the other side of the ledger, we can move on to page 12. As I mentioned from the outset, Governor was focused on taking care of more one-time expenditures that might have a cost today, but either have no cost in the out years or actually provide benefit to the state in the out years. Again, making sure that we're spending our resources and our surplus on items that cost today, but we can protect resources across the horizon. This is the list of everything that's in the budget that has a one-time price tag with it. I'm not going to go through the details of every single one, but I do want to dive deeper on several of these over the next couple of pages. So if we flip the page to page 13 here, this is the first and the largest of the items. The governor wants to make another $500 million deposit into the Budget Stabilization Fund. At the bottom of this page, you'll see a chart of the national average. If you take all 50 states and average up what they have both in dollars and as a percent of their expenditures, what the average stabilization funds have looked like over time. Kansas didn't have a stabilization fund until 2018, and we didn't have money in it until 2020, and that was only $81 million. So we wouldn't have even been a blip on this. So based on the work that the legislature has done over the past couple of years, our current balance actually stands at about $1 billion. She wants to put another $500 million in there. By putting $500 million in there, that'll take us to a balance of about $1.5 billion. And that's about 15% of our base tax revenues, which is what she wants to have as sort of the cap. That's a little bit above the national average. You can see on the chart below, national average is closer to 12 or 13%, but it's certainly not out of the norm. Coupled with putting money in here, she's also going to be introducing legislation a little bit later in session that will modify the existing Budget Stabilization Fund statute. The intent there is to just ensure that it is kind of walled off from any pullings from it that don't need to be pulled from it. Want to make sure that we identify that it is used for revenue loss. So if revenues fall short of the estimates, not if they fall short year over year from a tax cut, but just if they fall short of the estimates, that would really be the trigger to pull from the stabilization fund. Still up to the legislature to authorize that pulling from the stabilization fund. It is not moving that authority outside the legislature, but want to make sure that it's identified what the purpose of this fund is for. Also want to talk about putting some annual caps on how much could be withdrawn. So if there is a substantial downturn in revenues in a year, instead of solving the entirety of the problem just with the stabilization fund, we can look at both the stabilization fund and what our expenditures are at that point in time. So capping the annual withdrawal from the stabilization fund. Also, and this provision doesn't sit in the stabilization fund statute. It actually sits in the director of the budget statutes as building the governor's budget recommendation. But under current law, a governor can count the balance of the stabilization fund towards the 7.5% ending balance requirement. She wants to get rid of that. Make sure that we're only counting our SGF as our ending balance, because that's what we need to operate throughout the year, and have the stabilization fund completely separate and only used for times of a severe economic downturn. We'll have a little bit more details on that in the coming weeks, but want to make sure that we put that out there so there's no surprises down the road. Moving on to page 14 for those following along online. The next large deposit would be $220 million of set-aside money for an infrastructure leveraging fund. So the federal bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed sometime in the last year, I don't remember exactly when, set up a formula for funding to various states, and there's various streams of funding. This is completely different than what ARPA had in terms of state discretionary funds. It's really directed money, it's formula money, and there are several streams of these funds that have either matching requirements or competitive grants that locals or states have to apply for. So by setting funds aside, the state can make sure that we unlock more of these streams of federal dollars that are out there so we can fully leverage that bill to get after some really good and long-term beneficial infrastructure projects. Part of the funds will be used for technical support. We can bring in some consultants that have looked at this and done this with a number of states. And part of the funds will be there for state matching dollars or even local matching dollars should some of the locals need it to unlock some of the federal dollars in their communities. There's an existing infrastructure hub that was led by Secretary Lorenz with Department of Transportation. It was consisted of a few cabinet agency heads and also some vested stakeholders throughout the state. And this was one of the recommendations they had. Secretary Lorenz did give a presentation about what's happening across the country to the Legislative Budget Committee in October. And there was a slide in there that showed what some other states are doing as well. I've got that. I can recirculate if needed. But this $220 million set aside is actually in line with what a lot of other states are doing. The closest comp would be West Virginia. They set aside $250 million for projects just like this. The state of Michigan, I think, has somewhere in that same neighborhood. So this is in line with what a lot of states are doing and should really help us get some long-term benefit there. Moving to page 15, we had a little bit of this last year. Actually, we had a lot of this last year and a little bit more of it this year. Some debt buy down and some debt avoidance, so avoiding future interest costs. So as you might recall, last year, the Water Office informed us that we had 5 reservoirs that had futures contracts with the Army Corps of Engineers that had a balloon payment due at some point in the future, and we didn't have any existing revenue streams going against those to help pay those down in time. So the legislature put, I believe, $80 million, if I'm not mistaken, to buy down 3 of those, and those 3 had the most immediate due date. There's 2 remaining, and that's for the Milford and the Perry reservoirs, and the current price tag on those pardon me, is about $53 million based on the interest that's accrued so far. If we wait to pay those off on the due date, either 2034 or 2041, it would cost us $82 million. So it would be advantageous to go ahead and just pay those off now and not have to worry about it. So the governor is proposing $53 million to the Water Office to pay that debt and be done with it. That A, eliminates debt from our books, and then B, we can keep existing resources within the Water Office to ensure that they're using that money for strategic plans to ensure that we protect our water reserves across the state for years to come. On the debt avoidance side, there was an announcement made the other day that the new veterans home that the legislature has approved, there was a site selected here in Topeka, adjacent to the Topeka VA. In the approval that was given over the past couple of years by the legislature, pardon me, there was authority for the KCVAO to go out and actually issue bonds to pay for the state share of that. So instead of issuing bonds, we're carrying a balance in our state institutions building fund. So the governor is proposing to use that balance and just pay cash for the state share of that. That would save us well over $10 million in interest costs, assuming the rates stay at what they're at right now. And it just pays cash and gets a building that we desperately need stood up. This is, of course, contingent upon the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs approving our project for construction in fiscal 24. We don't know if they've approved that yet, but having a dedicated funding source does increase your score as they're looking at the prioritization of applications that are sitting there right now. So this helps us hopefully get towards the front of that list. And I will say that I believe the way it works is there's a host of applications out there. They're going to select a few to approve for next year. I believe that those that didn't get approved simply move up the list and are considered for the subsequent years. But this should help us get up the priority list. So moving into the world of human services, we can skip straight to slide 17. Medicaid expansion. So the governor is again proposing Medicaid expansion in Kansas to start 1/1/24. This will be the 5th budget in a row that has funding for Medicaid expansion, but it's a little bit different than the first 3, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. But last year, when I stood in front of you and proposed Medicaid expansion, I told you that Kansas was one of 12 states that had not yet expanded Medicaid. Since that time, South Dakota voters approved Medicaid expansion in South Dakota, so we are now one of 11 states that has not yet expanded Medicaid. On top of that, every single state that shares a border with Kansas has expanded Medicaid. So Oklahoma, Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado. That's important because I know years ago there was I don't want to say fear, but there was conversation about whether if Kansas was an island of an expansion state surrounded by non-expansion states, there might be an influx of folks utilizing services at a reduced rate. Now the opposite is true. Kansas is an island of a non-expansion state surrounded by expansion states. And what providers are reporting to us is that they're seeing providers leaving Kansas to go to states that have expanded Medicaid because they're getting fully reimbursed for the folks instead of providing care for free. The ongoing cost of Medicaid expansion in Kansas is about $1 billion, all funds, but the state share of that ongoing is about $40 to $50 million because of the federal, the 90% federal, and then also the privilege fee that comes in and some of the other offsets. So it's about 4 to 5 cents on the dollar for the investment of $1 billion of ongoing costs. However, when ARPA passed a couple of years ago, there was a provision that was put in there that for any state that has not yet expanded Medicaid that chooses to do so, they'll get an incremental 5 percentage point enhanced FMAP on their base Medicaid population for 8 calendar quarters. What that means in Kansas is for those 8 calendar quarters, we anticipate the numbers to be about $370 million to $450 million of SGF that we don't need to spend on the base Medicaid population for those 2 years. So that's enough to cover the state's share of ongoing Medicaid expansion costs for about 8 years. Additionally, the way it is in the budget is we've netted all the costs together like we do every year. Because of the additional federal dollars that we'd get from that 5 percentage point increase, by expanding Medicaid in fiscal 24, we will actually save $70 million of SGF relative if we just operated CanCare without expanding. That number grows in fiscal 25, and there's another savings in fiscal 26 because of the enhanced FMAP that we get on the base CanCare population. So by not expanding Medicaid, we would pay more SGF to cover the base population. Staying with human services into the CanCare program. A substantial sum of money to increase some of the rates for the waiver programs. You might recall last year there was about a 25% increase for IDD waiver reimbursements. There was one particular code, targeted case management, that did not get that rate increase because it's actually a state plan service. So it's not a waiver service, it's a state plan service. So the governor recognizes that we need to make sure that that one gets up to par with the other, with the waiver rates. So she's proposing $1.5 million of SGF to increase that one particular code by 25% to make it on par with the other IDD reimbursement rates. Additionally, she wants to put in $7.1 million of SGF to standardize reimbursement rates across the waivers. So in some of the different waivers, the frail elderly, the physically disabled, the brain injury waiver, there are services that are offered to each of the waivers that are similar across each of them, but right now they have different reimbursement rates. And what you could have by that is having providers provide these services shift into just one waiver and provide services there because it's a higher reimbursement rate. So we want to make sure that the rates are equal across each of those waivers, which is really going to help build capacity in the waiver population. We've heard a lot over the years that we have a lack of provider capacity with the waivers. So by providing these enhanced rates and making sure that everything is the same across each of these waivers, it should help with provider capacity over the years. Certainly not the silver bullet to make sure we get all the way there, but any little bit that we can do on the waiver population is certainly going to help. Also, $3.7 million to increase the rates, and I missed a word in here, rates for the brain injury rehab facilities. That does double the daily rate for the intensive rehabilitation treatment. So that does maintain the current capacity and hopefully entices other providers to come into this space as well to, again, provide enhanced capacity there. On the foster care side, Governor wants to put $5.1 million of SGF in there to increase the daily reimbursement rate for relative and non-kinship foster homes. So licensed foster homes get a daily reimbursement rate at, I don't know what the, well, I do know what the level is, get the daily reimbursement rate of X, we'll say. Relative and non-kinship homes get a substantially lower reimbursement rate. It's about half of what the foster homes get. So this $5.1 million will increase that rate, not to get it to the same as foster homes, but it gets to about 70% of what foster homes make, still leaving room to entice folks to really take on and get fully licensed as a foster home. Also putting money in there to support aged out and aging out foster care youth. So increasing the amount of the monthly subsidy for independently living youth. Right now, that subsidy is well below the federal poverty level. So the governor would like to get that up to the federal poverty level. Also enhance funding for the We Can Drive program. That's going to ensure that we can fund the current program and grow the footprint into other regions of the state. For those that don't know, this takes foster care kids that are aging out or towards that age and provides them tools to learn how to drive, gives them the driver's education, make sure they can get that driver's license, because that's critical as they become independent youth to ensure that they're prepared to get into the job market. Moving forward to the next slide, talking about investments for our veterans. Adding $2.9 million across both fiscal 23 and fiscal 24 to increase the staffing levels at both the Veterans Home and the Soldiers Home. Right now, they are understaffed and their census is getting back up to pre-pandemic levels. I don't think it's quite there yet, but it's certainly increasing over the past year. So making sure that we can have necessary providers there, and hopefully that also mitigates the need for contract staffing in the out years, which should reduce costs over time. We talked about paying cash for the new Veterans Home, and then a host of enhancements across all the campuses, across all the states. I won't go into all of them, but you can see the list of projects that the governor is wanting to approve this year using SIBF for the vast majority of those. Pardon me. Okay, so we'll switch gears and get into education and workforce development on page 21. So continuing investments in elementary and secondary education. So the governor is again proposing fully funding the base K-12 education. This would mark the 5th year in a row fully funding. So congratulations to everybody. It's 5 years in a row of fully funding the base K-12. That means any student who's entering 4th grade has had the fully funded schools their entire time, which is a huge step. The governor is also, again, recommending an out-year appropriation for K-12 education to ensure that schools know the funding is going to be there the next year as they're signing contracts for the next year, instead of waiting until May of right before those contracts start. Also, the governor would like to add $3 million of SGF to the mental health intervention team pilot. It's been a very successful program over the past 5 years. And this $3 million is going to help increase the capacity such that another 15 to 25 districts should be able to take advantage of this program. The current funding that's in school finance for safe and secure grants is ARPA dollars. So to ensure that the safe and secure grants continue moving forward, the governor is going to transition that to $5 million of SGF, and that'll be part of the base moving forward. She also would like to add Narcan and emergency communication devices as allowable uses. Don't have to tell everybody here what's happening with fentanyl. It's just critical that we have a device there to help students should they need it in the case of emergency to fight that. The schools for the blind and the deaf, we're adding funding to have school resource-like officers. They actually won't be police officers with the KCK or the Olathe Police. They're going to be employees of the schools for the blind or the schools for the deaf. It was important to them to make sure that they had employees at their schools because they have some real stringent requirements about the culture at their school and the requirements. For example, at the School for the Deaf, they require that every single employee there learns some level of ASL sign language to make sure that they're part of the culture and able to communicate with the students. So these will be school resource officer type folks, but they'll actually be employees of these schools. And as a reminder, the Schools for the Blind and the Schools for the Deaf aren't USDs. They function as kind of a separate state agency, so they get a different funding stream. So we need to make sure that we're cognizant of that as we do this. The bottom bullet is really a technical note. The way it is right now, the capital aid that goes to schools, about $200 million a year, currently is a revenue transfer. So it shows up as a revenue item. The way it used to be, and what the governor would like to propose moving it back to, is making it a demand transfer, which makes it show on the expenditure line. This was moved from a demand transfer to a revenue transfer some time ago because the ending balance is only required to be 7.5% of expenditures and demand transfers. So if you eliminate $200 million, it reduces your ending balance requirements. So she wants to put that back down to the expense line. So our 7.5% ending balance is really of all expenses and demand transfers that we're sending out. The net effect is it's going to look like expenditures increase by $200 million in the year that we move it. It's not. It's just a shift from revenue to demand transfer. It's just an accounting mechanism. Want to make sure we're clear about that. So on page 22, sticking with K-12, Governor has been wanting to get on the path to fully compliant with the 92% of excess costs for special education. So the Kansas Board of Education put out a recommendation of how we could get there over a 5-year time frame instead of trying to get there all in 1 year to make it a little bit easier for the state budget to get there. So the governor agrees with that recommendation and that glide path and is going to put us on that path to get there over the next 5 years, starting in fiscal 24. What that's going to require is an incremental $72 million each of the next 5 years for us to get to 92% by fiscal 28. You can see on here that we have not met the state law requirements of 92% in over a decade. So this, again, will get us back in compliance with state law. It also allows us time to work with the federal government to try to increase their share of special education costs because we know that they have not been living up to their up to 40% of excess costs. So the governor is going to pull together a group within the state to work with other states near us and try to partner with our federal partners to ensure that they can increase their share of special education costs instead of just leaving it at the state level. The end goal would be to get more money from the feds, again, to get them up to their share, and that would reduce state share over time. So this is kind of a two-part approach here, but want to at least get on the path to getting compliant with the $72 million a year. Moving on to post-secondary education. Last year, we had a historic budget for post-secondary education of over $1 billion of SGF. I believe that was the first time that we got there. Want to make sure that we're making more investments in higher education because higher education, all levels of education really, but higher education is a workforce development tool. There's been a lot of activity in the state lately, all across all four corners of the state of new businesses or expanding businesses. So I want to make sure that we have a trained, ready, and capable workforce for all those businesses as they continue to come to Kansas. So with that, the governor is proposing $66 million of base increases to higher education, and I've listed out what that $66 million will go to. $20 million will be for increasing financial aid for the state's public universities. Almost $22 million to help offset the cost of inflation that's happened across the systems. Their bills have gone up like most of ours. $10.6 million for university-specific programs, and then $8.5 million for recruitment and retention that was identified by a study that the Board of Regents can give you more details on. On the one-time expenditure side, it's $42 million, another $20 million towards deferred maintenance next year of state money to be matched dollar for dollar with non-state monies at the university. So really a $40 million investment to start attacking the deferred maintenance. Governor recognizes that deferred maintenance is an ongoing cost and this $20 million won't fix it. What she does not want to do is commit to this $20 million every single year in perpetuity, but rather revisit this topic every single year to see if we have the resources available as a state to make the next deposit against deferred maintenance and attack it that way. So that's why it's showing up as a one-time expenditure, but still want to have the conversation on the table every single year to see what are the needs, what are the available resources. Also $12 million for cybersecurity and IT upgrades, and that's across the techs in the 2 years and the 4 years as well. And then $10 million to continue some of the demolition projects that started last year. Moving into more purely workforce recruitment and retention efforts. So part of the $20 million for the Board of Regents for enhanced scholarships, there's another program they want to initiate, and we're putting $4 million of state money against that for micro internship programs. The thought being that the universities can connect with the local businesses all across the state, wherever they might be, to set up internship programs such that college students get involved with local businesses right now while they're in college. And they show that when you do that and connect a student with local business, your retention rate of keeping those trained students in the state upon graduation certainly go up. So it's an effort to ensure that we have long-term workforce development pipeline. $3 million of EDIF to the Department of Commerce for some marketing campaigns geared specifically towards workforce in Kansas. That'd be kind of a bifurcated approach. There's going to be targeting recent outflow of Kansans, trying to get them back in, but also focusing on Kansas that are in the state to make sure that we identify the workforce needs and the tools that we have here to assist folks in getting connected with employers. And then another $500,000 of EDIF to the recently announced Office of the Apprenticeship to ensure that we keep that program up and running and get folks trained. Page 25, some what you might call non-traditional workforce development. Governor recognizes that housing and childcare are absolutely workforce development tools, right? The more childcare slots we have available, the more folks can take advantage of that, have their kids in childcare, get an early education, and go into work. Also housing, there's a housing shortage across the state. We made some pretty historic investments last year. Governor wants to take that a step further. So you can see here, we've got about $3.5 million pegged for early childhood education or child care, trying to increase the number of slots across the state. And then also $20 million of SGF into the housing revolving loan program that's administered by the Housing Resources Corporation. You might recall last year that we made a $20 million deposit into a revolving housing loan program at Kansas Resources Corporation, but it was geared only to rural counties. This extra deposit will go into the same fund, but we'll put language in there that protects at least 50%, the first deposit, for rural counties. The second tranche of funding will be available for the entirety of the state to include both rural and urban Kansas. Again, we've had new development, business development going up all across the state, so we want to make sure that we have money in the housing funds to build those houses for the workers that are moving to those areas of the state. Staying on state workforce, talking about state employees. So continuing our efforts for recruitment and retention of state employees. It doesn't matter what committee you sit on. I'm guessing you've heard that agencies are having a hard time hiring and keeping qualified folks in state government. So the governor would like to, again, recommend a 5% statewide pay adjustment with some exclusions. This would exclude the judicial branch. It would exclude the teachers at the schools for the blind and the deaf because they're tied to the Olathe School District and whatever those teachers get. Excludes elected officials, although I heard there was a bill introduced that might help that. And also any agencies that are on an approved career progression plan. The reason it excludes the judiciary is because their budget is a pass-through. So they submit that to the Division of Budget and the governor must just pass that to the legislature. They have their own pay plan included in that. So it's not that we're not trying to cover them. It's just they have something separate and it's a pass-through. On top of the 5% statewide adjustment, the Office of Personnel Services at Department of Administration did a study last summer, and I think they presented it to some of the groups here, that shows that when you break it down by job classification and job title, many of the job titles in the state are woefully under what we consider the market rates. And they have a very defined market basket that has in-state public sector, in-state private sector, surrounding state public sector, and they weight them based on the likelihood of them being a direct competitor. So on top of the 5% statewide pay adjustment, the governor wants to make sure that anybody who is still more than 5% below market, according to that study and according to their job title, gets to within 5% of the market. So 5% statewide, and then anybody who still remains more than 5% below the market comp, according to that study, gets within 5%. Between the two proposals there, it's about $65 million SGF. Don't quote me on the exact number. It's in that neighborhood, and I'll get that for you. And then on top of that, we want to fund a comprehensive workforce study to happen sometime this summer. So about $500,000 going again to the Office of Personnel Services to commission a study to look at all things state employment related to ensure that we can have Kansas as a state, the employer of choice in the state. It's not just going to look at pay. It will look at pay, but it'll look at what pay means wage compression, what are targets, what is a real market basket we need to be looking at. It's also going to look at some of the fringe benefits. Do we have everything set up right for the ancillary benefits for state employees? Is there something different we can do with remote work? Is there something different we can do with workforce work schedules? So a comprehensive study that wants to be funded this summer. And then finally on this page, the governor would like to eliminate the overly restrictive language in the state bonus statute. Right now in statute, all bonuses paid out are tied to the IRS definition of discretionary. So we cannot give a bonus for recruitment, for a sign-on bonus. We can't give a retention bonus. It just has to be a bonus that is given for, I don't want to say no reason at all, but not tied to anything that would make somebody stick around. So clean this up so it can actually be a tool that we use for both recruitment and retention. Our surrounding states have gone in this direction as well. So we want to make sure that we're not falling behind in this space. There will be guardrails on the new statute that comes through to ensure that it is not abused. We can get into some of the guardrails later. And then cybersecurity and IT, I won't go through all of the projects, but what we've done is listed all the projects that we put funding behind for IT, whether it's systems upgrades, if it's just infrastructure upgrades, or if it's cybersecurity. Everything listed on here is a one-time cost. I would say the largest price tag, obviously, is the very top one there. $20.5 million to the Department of Labor to ensure the funding is in place to complete the UI modernization for their systems. We understand that it's likely going to take more than one fiscal year, but we want to get the money to Department of Labor, make sure they have it so they can fund that project as they hit the milestones, and the funding is there and there's no questions about it. So, reviewing our priorities. Again, top one there, no surprise, looking across the horizon. Make sure that we are protecting state resources across the horizon. Not just focus on the fiscal 24 ending balance, which is certainly important because that helps us manage cash flow throughout the year, but really looking at structural balance, making sure that revenues exceed expenditures. That is the key, because when you get to the out years, we have some obligations that will come up, expenses that will come up. And as Dr. Leopold talked about this morning, and as the chairman talked about as well, the enhanced FMAP that we've been getting for the past 3 years goes away. So we haven't had to spend as much SGF for the past 3 years on the Medicaid program. We're going to have to start spending more SGF on that going forward. Responsible and sustainable tax relief. Make sure that with the tax proposals that we have out here, they are sustainable and we are not harming the state's ability to meet its obligations across the horizon. Again, pulling forward the sales tax reduction on food is covered with existing surplus. The ongoing cost is already baked into the revenue forecast. Fully funding education to include special education, and then safeguarding against potential economic downturns in the future. Investing in a rainy day fund, minimize base spending increases, maximize one-time expenditures. The last page before I exit stage left is just the SGF outlook. Again, I talked a lot about structural balance. Fiscal 24 is structurally balanced by about $500 million. That means our revenues in 24 with this proposal exceed expenditures in this proposal by $500 million. If we rolled that forward 1 year with the K-12 that we're going to put in there and the reduction in FMAP, that structural balance is about $200 million. So when I talk about looking across the horizon, it's the ending balance here today isn't the same ending balance next year, but we are still structurally balanced next year with this proposal. Again, there is a $200 million shift from the revenue side to the expenditure side for K-12. Again, that's just an accounting maneuver. There's nothing else there. We talked about the enhanced FMAP. And then to put some numbers to it, the governor's fiscal 24 budget, the increases she's putting in base spending is only a 3.2% increase over the fiscal 23 approved. That's less than half the inflation rate, even that came out today. That was the lowest that we've seen in some time. So I guess in closing, we're leaving $1.984 billion at the end of fiscal 24 in the SGF, plus $1.5 billion in the rainy day fund. But we're, again, focused on structural balance, looking across the horizon, ensuring that we can meet our obligations over the next couple of years. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think we're done.
Well, you're not done yet, because we do have some questions before you, as you mentioned, exit stage left. So you'll be staying up there just for a little bit. I'm going to go back to the very first part of your presentation. And we have a lot of new members on the Appropriations Committee in the House. And so can you just kind of give a definition or elaborate on the certificate of indebtedness and how important it is that we haven't had to have that for 2 years passed by the State Finance Council?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. So the certificate of indebtedness is effectively an IOU from us to us. If you think about it in terms of your own personal checking account, what you're saying is, I'm allowed to run negative during the year because I promise you I'm going to make money by the end of the year to get me back to positive. That's effectively what it is. We have had a certificate of indebtedness in place for more than 20 years. And it's just a cash flow management tool. In all fairness, there is a mismatch between the timing of expenditures and timing of revenues in the state, right? We get a lot of revenues at the end of the year, but we have expenditures at the beginning of the year. So it's used to make sure that we have enough cash to get through the year. The ending balance requirements are put in place to try to mitigate the need for a certificate of indebtedness to ensure that we have cash to get through the year. Historically, we haven't been staying at that 7.5%. So now that we're at that 7.5%, we've pulled forward that delayed payment, that K-12. The delayed payment, what that did was effectively overstated our ending balance every year by about $200 million, right? We'd end the year with, say, $500 million, but 3 days later, we had a $200 million bill due that we should have paid a couple weeks ago. So it's a huge deal, to your point. We had a certificate of indebtedness for over 20 years in a row. The past 2 years, because of our strong cash position and our strong cash management, we've had enough cash to get through the low points of the year without having to pull a certificate of indebtedness.
All right, thank you for defining that for us. Next, in regards to the debt retirement, $53 million basically for Milford and Perry Lake. And if we would pay that debt service off this coming fiscal year, what would that annual savings be for the Kansas Water Office?
It's a great question. I will have to reach out to them. So the way these are structured is they're a little bit different than our typical debt, right? When we issue general debt, we have a bond and we have an annual debt service payment. These, as I understand it, are actually balloon payments, which means you owe us X amount at the end of the term, and you don't have to pay us an annual payment. But if you don't pay an annual payment, your interest compounds every single year, so your balance is growing based on the accrued interest. So there's not a required payment, as I understand it, to the Corps of Engineers. But with the bill that passed last year, the legislature did say that any savings that came about by paying off those three, find some new revenue streams and put those towards making payments. I'll check with the water office, but I think they're making payments in the neighborhood of $2 million-ish right now.
Okay, I just kind of want to know what the dollar figure was that would be alleviated if we would happen to pay off that debt.
It's more about not compounding the interest over the next 15 years.
Okay. Next, if you could elaborate a little bit on the Strengthening People and Revitalizing Kansas process. Now, obviously, the State Finance Council approved $374 million, which was a remaining amount that was from the American Rescue Plan Act back in December. Basically, it's going to be divided into 4 different buckets as it was defined with the State Finance Council. So last year in the budgeting process, we actually spent some of that money that was sent to the state from the federal government through the ARPA funds. This year, that's not going to be available unless we do have some recouping of funds that was dedicated in the previous budget bill. But can you please just elaborate a little bit on the Spark process?
I will do my best, Mr. Chair. I was admittedly not part of the Spark process that ran through the recovery office, and I wasn't on the committee, but obviously I followed it as closely as I possibly could. So the Spark process, as you mentioned, they had their last meeting, I think right before Christmas or New Year's. It was late December. And they took a look at the recommendations that were coming at them, and they approved 4 different buckets for the remaining funds to go to. Efficiency and modernization was one bucket. Health and education was one bucket. Connectivity, I think, was one bucket. And there was some money for base 2.0 was another bucket.
Economic revitalization.
Right. Thank you. Economic revitalization. That was next on my list. So it's $374 million in total. And what that does, as the chairman states, is effectively locks that money away and it's no longer available for use. The monies are going to be administered by the state agencies where it has the most natural fit. And the state agencies have reached out to stakeholders to say, make sure you submit applications. I believe by tomorrow, applications are due the agencies and the teams will review those applications to see which ones fit the criteria the best, kind of score them, and then make the awards. And I believe we're trying to make those announcements by the end of this month, if I'm not mistaken. So hopefully that money will be spoken for, and we'll know exactly where it will be going at that point in time. Right now, we just know that it's to be used for each of the buckets. As you mentioned, there is another 148.1-ish that was from the $250 million set aside for the UI Trust Fund that was not needed. But right now, that money sits in the LCC, and it is locked there until such time that legislative action is taken to remove it from that fund. However, as a part of that final SPARK meeting, the SPARK committee and then subsequently the State Finance Council did make recommendations on the prioritization of those funds when they get recouped on where they could be spent based on what they've been seeing throughout the SPARK process, where there could still be some areas of need.
All right, thank you for kind of going through that and what the SPARK process was in the latter part of calendar year 2022. In the governor's budget, she had IT infrastructure expenditures. In the efficiency and modernization advisory panel with the SPARK process, we were identifying, and we have money dedicated towards IT infrastructure for the state of Kansas. Is this duplicative?
We tried to not be duplicative. We didn't know exactly which projects would be funded. I should have mentioned, and thank you for the reminder, that there are several of these projects that the governor is funding with SGF that we're also going to have proviso language that says, if federal funds become available for this project, we will use federal dollars and lapse the SGF back into the SGF. There are some agencies that have some of the items that are in the governor's budget recommendation. I know agencies that are going to also submit part of the SPARK process. If that gets approved, we'll use the SPARK money, we'll lapse the SGF. But we wanted to make sure these were important enough to have a backstop of SGF to make sure they got funded.
Okay, because I think Senator Fagg was on the advisory panel as well, and we had the discussion about upgrading our web presence and the IT infrastructure with the state of Kansas, because to be quite honest, it's very poor. And so we dedicated funds from the ARPA fund, the ARPA dollars with the SPARK process in order to have those upgrades done. So I just want to make sure that we're not duplicating those with the governor's request. And then also, if we have the federal dollars available for a particular agency to upgrade their IT infrastructure, then that's going to be utilized before state general fund dollars.
Correct.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Prophet, for sharing this morning. I actually have two questions. It seems like and both questions relate to this first comment. It seems like that best policy always is simple or is more simple and can be implemented in a fashion that's reasonable and simplistic, and that also provides parity across the system. So with that in mind, these two questions focus on that. The first is a tax policy question, and the second is a special education question. So I'll just ask the tax policy. So we can all recognize that as the base gets broader in tax policy, that it actually can reduce the rate. Whenever you take people out of the base, then it's going to cause the rate to go up. Both provisions provided in the budget that relate to this are more about reducing the base and providing exemptions. And one is the tax holiday, and one is related to the feminine hygiene products and other types of items like diapers. When that happens, that means more people will have to pay the difference for that. And so my question on that for the governor is, isn't that an implicit recognition that our tax policy is uncompetitive?
Thank you for the question. I think your overarching theme is maybe, increase the base, reduce the rate is effectively where you're going with that. And this kind of goes the opposite direction, where we're reducing the base and the rate in this example. I would say that the food sales tax, there is a recognition from the governor that the food sales tax is among the most regressive taxes out there, whereby it has a disproportionate impact on lower income families, more so than higher income families, because these are items of need that folks need to survive. So they're spending a greater proportion of their income on food items and feminine hygiene products and with young parents' diapers. I remember, personally speaking, I was a very young and not very wealthy parent, so buying diapers was very, very difficult for me. So any savings that we can get there is helping folks that are on the lower income spectrum. I will also say that it's recognition that just looking at the colors on this map, more than about 2/3 of states have enacted similar policies where there's no sales tax on food. And a lot of states have the same policy for feminine hygiene products and diapers. So trying to make sure that we're competitive and also making sure we're taking care of our most needy. And there's no impact to our ongoing ability to fund our obligations. That was one thing that she and I discussed at great length a year and a half ago when we first started talking about this. I can't tell you how many times she asked me, do we have the money to fund this down the road? I know we have it this year. Can we fund this 5 years from now? So making sure that we weren't going to have to cut other services in the state to make other folks bear the responsibility of funding this.
And thank you for that response. I will say that out of states that have tax holidays, it's actually going down. States are removing those tax holidays, and the Tax Foundation actually considers it poor policy. But in terms of the overall idea of what's best in policy, let's just reduce sales tax. Let's just reduce the rate rather than having exemptions. But that's more a policy discussion. The second question relates to special education, and there's a question with this. In November, there was an interim for special education funding that highlighted deficiencies and inconsistencies and disparities in the special education formula. It showed that the formula did not adequately address equity. For example, out of 286 school districts, 150 of those school districts were receiving 92% of excess cost or above. About a 99% was the average rate of excess cost. And what that means is that some school districts were getting about 250 or 260% of excess cost, while others were getting 60%, especially our urban schools. They were carrying the bulk of this loss. So with that in mind, knowing that we've got this great imbalance of equity between our districts, also knowing that in Kansas, we are one of the few handful of states that has a formula that bases it on excess costs rather than something more sustainable and simplified, and many other things that we talked about in that time period. Did the governor and staff take time to review the long list of questions, concerns, and discrepancies and alternative solutions that were identified in that special education interim?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thank you for the question. I'll answer backwards, I think, in terms of the order of the questions. The governor, as I mentioned, this is not just a one-track approach. It's not just throwing more money at it to make sure that we get there, although that is critical. The alternative that she wants to pursue is working with other states to identify what the best path forward is, and also working with other states to push the federal Congress to appropriate more funds to special education. Right now, they're well below the 40% that and I don't think it's a requirement they get to 40%, it's up to 40%. But while that's out there, let's have the federal partners meet their MOE standards and produce more funds for the states. So it's a two-track approach to get there. As it relates to the 92%, I don't know that she and I together talked about any of the alternatives from that committee. I'd be happy to look more at that. I don't feel prepared to comment on any of the specifics because I don't know the background or what the math was that went into that. Would welcome the opportunity to come to your office and sit and look through that and chat about that. But the important thing to note here is that on the state's books in Kansas state statute, we are supposed to cover 92% of excess costs. And we have not done that for over a decade. So she wants to put us on a path to covering that. Also recognizing that states have had to pull from the general operating funds, even during these 5 years of fully funding K-12, some districts to cover the special education costs. So just getting on a glide path to get there compliant with state law.
Representative Williams.
Yes, thank you for expressing that opinion on that. And honestly, when we're talking about excess costs and when we're talking about what solutions are, I would invite a discussion on that because there are many other options. And in terms of using money from your general operations, one thing that we found was that local option budget money that's explicitly connected to special education students is not being counted. So we've got probably $160 million of special education money that is not part of that formula. And so when they're grabbing money from that fund and putting it over to the other fund, it really is using it appropriately. So I just make that comment, and also very glad that the governor recognizes that the federal government is about $330 million short just last year of what their quote promise would be. And so I think everyone should be working with their congressional delegation to get that changed. Thank you.
Senator McGinn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 14, when you talked about the bipartisan infrastructure law, this is money that can be used for primarily shovel ready. And I know Secretary Lorenz did a good job trying to talk to our local, our counties and our municipalities back home. But I believe that we are on a very tight timeline on this. And if we don't use it by a certain time, we're not even going to get take advantage of that. And that is why one of the things that they're trying to do is help some of the small communities have learn how to write the grant program and that type of thing and help them. But I just want to confirm that is a very critical timeline for those dollars.
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator, for the question. Yes, I don't know what the exact timelines are, but as with most federal dollars, there are specific dates by which you have to obligate the funds and then expend the funds. This is not open-ended. It does not go on in perpetuity, so we do need, time is of the essence here, so making sure that we set aside the funds now to assist the locals with whatever we can do to unlock those funds for them.
Okay. I just want to give a heads up to my colleagues that is important money for our folks back home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That went faster than I expected. I thought I'd be way further down on the list. All right, I have a few questions here. Thanks for being here, Director Profit. The first one that comes up is regarding the water office debt repayment. I'm a fan. Don't get me wrong. I love reducing debt. I think that's a fantastic use of excess revenue. My concern here, though, is I looked at the interest rates at 2.6 and 3%, and we're at over 4 now. I'm wondering if there are better opportunities for utilizing that money. And I'm just, again, spitballing. I haven't actually crunched the numbers yet, but if just looking at Capers, for example, paying down Capers a little bit more with that $50 million. Did you crunch those numbers? Am I walking a path that's already been tread?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. No, you're not off base. The interest rates are substantially lower than current market rates, but current market rates are in a different spot than they were 12 months ago and likely will be in 12 months. That is something we discussed and considered. Is it better to just wait and invest the money in overnight accounts and try to grow a little bit? When we started doing the math and seeing what the payoff would be for trying to do some self arbitrage, if you will, invest in something else, get some rates, the payoff wasn't worth having this obligation out there and the temptation that those funds, when they become due and we have the money, might be used for something else. So just wipe this from the books. And again, the other thing is the water office, I did get a text, they're spending about $2.5 million a year to pay towards this. They will keep those funds and they can redirect those funds to existing water office priorities for down the road. So it's kind of twofold: eliminating debt, letting them get after some strategic projects.
Representative Sutton.
All right, I can see that. I appreciate the thought that went into it. I think I still want to play with the numbers a little bit, but I definitely appreciate that. One of the statements that you made, and this is going to the veterans home. Where do I find that?
Should be the same page.
Was that the same page? Oh, good. Oh, here we go. Yes. One of the things that, and I'm doing this from memory, I thought the census was going down in the various veterans' homes. Is this where you say that the census is going up? Is that anticipatory of the new veterans' home being built?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize. I was on the wrong page. I thought you meant building the home. So you're looking at page 19 and the funding for staff shortages as the census is going up.
Yes, that is correct.
So the census was going down. It certainly went down during the pandemic, and it took some time to stabilize. I visited the Winfield Veterans Home this summer and met with their administrator there, and then the Fort Dodge Soldiers Home administrator also came over, and they showed some graphs that showed the census was starting to tick back up. Candidly, I haven't looked at it over the past 2 months, but as of September, it was trending back upwards. And even without the increases, they were still relatively short on staff. So trying to make sure they can bolster staff, they've been relying on contract staff to try to bolster state staff and kind of wean ourselves off the more expensive contract staff.
Very good.
Representative Sutton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That makes sense to me. The only other question I had is on the cybersecurity regarding the Department of Labor modernization. Looks like, is this in addition to what was already funded for the modernization program, or is this restating what was already funded?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. This, as I understand it, and I can follow up with Secretary Schultz to ensure I'm accurate here, is what we feel the remaining obligation for the balance of the project could be outside of what we've already spent. As with most IT projects, they're deliverable based, meaning as they hit a milestone deliverable, then the balance is due. So with the deliverables that are outstanding, I believe this 20.5 million should get us across the finish line when that project becomes complete.
All right. And just to
Representative
clarify,
Sutton.
and this is not an additional question, but just to clarify, so this is in addition to what was already funded 2 years ago?
I believe that to be accurate. Let me follow back up with you, please. My team will write that down and we'll get back to you this week.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Alcala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a few comments and two quick questions. When we leave here, the media will pound on us.
I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
The media will get to us and say, hey, what did you like about the budget? Or what didn't you like about the budget? 9 times out of 10, the comments will be what we don't like or what we have issues with. I want to emphasize what I like with a couple of questions. I like that we're pulling the food sales tax forward if we can get the support to do that. It's a relief for folks. It's a tax relief for folks. I like that we're staying out of the KDOT budget because I've traveled a lot this summer and I think Kansas has some of the best roads. And I seriously mean that. The minute you cross the Kansas state line, you can tell. I like that we're paying down debt and tax relief for folks. I always thought if you're going to have a solid household, you got to get rid of your debt. And if you have the money to do it, that should be the priority. My question to you is because with climate change and the drought, I like the rainy day fund. And I noticed that the governor wants to put $500 million in the rainy day fund. Is there a cap to that, or where are we at on the top of that rainy day fund? Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question, Representative, and thank you for pointing out the highlights. I appreciate that. In current statute, there is no cap. So the way it works right now is the formula that funds the rainy day formula is at the end of the fiscal year, if the final fiscal year end revenues exceed the April estimate, 50% of that excess goes into the rainy day fund, 50% stays with the state general fund. There's no cap. With this, the governor wants to put, like I said, another $500 million in there and take it to $1.5 billion. She does believe that a cap is necessary, especially if we're going to leave a formula to fund it. Once you get above a certain point, it becomes a law of diminishing returns, and maybe we have excess money in there. We need to rebalance expenditures and revenues. So she wants to have a cap of about 15% on the revenue side, not the expenditure side, but the revenue side. Since it would be used for revenue loss, she wants to tie it to the revenue side.
I can agree with that. That'd be like having having product on the floor and no revenue because it's sitting. And so, but I do think that it's good that we have that fund. My second question for you is, and something that I've always supported, is the pay increase of 5% to our state employees. I've always thought that state employees were underpaid. I always thought that we had an aging state employee group that sometimes just couldn't pick up and go compete with in the job market with kids coming right out of college. If this 5% increase is applied, where are we at on the market rate of retention and being competitive?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to pull that. We won't be all the way there, and that's why the second part of the proposal is out there. After the 5%, we show about 5,000 employees that would still be more than 5% below the market based on their job title, based on the work that Office of Personnel Services has done. So certainly 5% statewide moves the needle. It's very, very welcomed by state employees, as you might imagine. But we went through such a long period of time where there were not state employee increases, but there were also increases to the out-of-pocket expense on the state employee health plan that effectively, there were some years that state employees saw a decrease. So the 5% moves the needle. It still leaves about 5,000 folks more than 5% below market. And the second part of the proposal would get those folks to within 5% of market.
Yeah, I'm good with 5%. I think that we got a ways to go before we get where we need to be, because I think a lot of that gets consumed through insurance increases and other things. I would say that on the tax break for retirees, I think that's good. I think that'll be good for our economy also because of the increase in Social Security for retirees. So I think they'll get some relief, and they'll also have a little more extra money to put back in the economy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Corbett.
Thank you. One of the things that I was hoping the budget would say is something that would kind of say, if you're a family or a retiree or something, come to Kansas. There's not very much growth in this budget, or why, if you were living out of the state, listening to this budget, why you would load your car up, bring your family, start a business, or come here to retire. You hammer the retirees on their retirement, and Kansas is not a cheap state to live in. One of the suggestions I have for you on page 4 on the food sales tax would be to add prepared food to the sales tax deal. Eliminate sales tax on prepared food. And you talk about the borders and people who live there. You know, people drive 10 miles to save a nickel on gas. Think how far the border states might drive to Kansas to save a few bucks on their meal. It'd be nice to see something proactive in this budget to get people not to stay here, but to come here and want to live. And that's just my comments.
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the comments. I certainly appreciate your desire to bring more folks to Kansas and make it a better place to live. The governor's goal is to make sure that Kansas is the best place to raise a family and to retire. I guess I would counter, and we can have this discussion further if we need to, that by reducing the tax liability on impacted retirees with the Social Security income cliff, that will entice more retirees to stay in Kansas, the state they love and the state they grew up in, and to keep more of the money that they've earned throughout their career that they're entitled to keep. The food sales tax rate, again, we're making it more competitive. So instead of driving Kansas out into Missouri or Nebraska or Colorado, where the food sales tax is cheaper, we're trying to remain competitive and not have an out migration. Also, when you think about a grocery store and where they're located across communities, they are generally the anchor of a larger retail center, right? So not only are folks driving across state lines to purchase their groceries, we don't have folks coming into Kansas to purchase groceries, but then also stop at the big box store or the local, the liquor store or a restaurant or anything else to spend more money here. So I think there's benefit for Kansas there. And the final thing I would note is that another driver of the headline inflation and why it's so high is the increases in the housing costs, right? And there's kind of a double whammy happening where the housing prices are going up, but the Fed has increased rates so much that the price of houses is now doubly more expensive because the interest rate on the mortgage is more expensive. If we attack the housing shortage, we can start to push down or at least mitigate the rising cost of housing, which also has a flow over effect into the rental market as well, making housing more modest across the state of Kansas than it might be in other states. So it's a little bit under the covers. It's not the flashy, sexy things you might think in terms of bringing folks here, but we are trying to do things to make sure that it's less expensive for Kansans here.
Representative Corbett.
Thank you. So on the suggestion on including prepared foods to your sales tax to zero, that would give the restaurant industry an enormous boost who were heavily penalized during the pandemic. But I think it'd be a great boost to bring a few more bucks into the state and give just a little good thought there. So keep that in mind.
Representative Helgerson.
Thank you very much. I may disagree with you a little bit on the housing, but we'll talk about that later.
Fair enough.
Certificate of indebtedness. You said we're not going to use those, but you're not changing the statute. They can be used anytime in the future, correct? You're not changing the statute. You're just saying this administration is not going to use it this year.
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Correct. What I think what I said was we have not had to use one for the past 2 years. If this budget remains intact and we continue to look across the horizon, I doubt we'll need one for the next 2 years either. But we are not changing statute.
Representative Helgerson.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned earlier about the $220 million program. I think it was a federal loan program to local communities. Have you thought about making it I said loan program, but you have it as a grant program. Have you thought about making it a loan program so the 220 comes back and we can reuse it as a revolving account with smaller communities, giving loans to communities to make the matching for the matching dollars so that they can move ahead with the projects and that we don't have to continually fund the local projects?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. Short answer, no, we did not consider making it a loan program. The federal money are grants, they're not loans, as you identified through your question there. A lot of the communities lack the resources to come up with the matching dollars or to unlock some of the federal dollars. So by providing this to them, we're hoping that the benefit to the communities will far outweigh the cost of the state in terms of the infrastructure projects that'll be presented. If they don't have the resources to come up with the funds right now, it would be hard to say, we know you don't have the resources, but we're going to give you a loan. Make sure you pay us back over time. So it's just a deposit over there. If we don't use it all, if we don't need it all, great. But I know Secretary Lorenz, while she was here, was big on matching dollars and partnering with local communities to make sure we get the most bang for the buck.
Representative Helgerson.
So you've thought about it, you made the decision to make it a grant program, not a loan program, and that's fine. I don't see anything in here, I'm sure it's in the budget, about the new state hospital for Sedgwick County, the additional funds or the additional costs that are going to go into operating another state hospital. Can you provide those sometime in the future?
Director Profit.
Yes, so that was the last State Finance Council meeting. They did release the $25 million of SGF to fund the additional hospital in Sedgwick County. We don't have the ongoing SGF in here, but that is something we can talk about once we have a better grasp of what that's going to look like going forward.
Well, also all the other details about having a state hospital and having some other entity building, staffing, and then turning it over to. I haven't. I don't know if any other legislators have seen any agreements that the state may have with the county. And final point, because I know we're rushed. You know, I look at this in 22, and we had $8.1 billion of expenditures, and we have $3 billion of reserves. I guess there's a couple way of looking at it. The next year we go up $1 billion in expenditures, and that's because we have an awful lot of money. I just look at it totally different. As my colleague from Shawnee always reminds me that there's other ways of creating economic development and benefit, and that is sometimes by giving the money back to local individuals and let them spend the money rather than us spending another $1 billion of revenue. And I know the argument's going to be, or the discussion's going to be, well, it was one-time money. Well, one-time money becomes permanent money, and it looks like some of it, at least, has become more permanent money. So I'm sure you and I will have this conversation throughout the session. Thank you.
Well, in regards to the mental health facility in Sedgwick County, as you mentioned, we just took action in the State Finance Council in releasing the $25 million. That's not, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not reflected in the fiscal year 2023 or 2024 budget because a site hasn't been selected. We don't know exactly where it's going to be located. And so technically, there's probably not going to be any operational costs until that facility is actually up and running and open, which could possibly not happen until fiscal year 2025 or even later. So that's probably the reason why it's not showing in the governor's budget, because we don't even know where that facility is going to be located in Sedgwick County. And I think Representative Landwehr had a comment as well.
Well, it's kind of along those lines because we do have the $15 million SGF that has been allocated. So is that reflected in this budget, the $15 million?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative, for the question. Yes, 15 million is in the fiscal 23 and 24 budget for the 50 regional beds. So to the chairman's point, any funding that was appropriated last year, so the 25 million was appropriated last year, so it is in the budget, but kind of as a standalone, and expenditures match revenues. But the ongoing costs we don't have in there. I'll be honest with you, I'm trying to read a text. And there's $15 million SGF in fiscal 23 and 24 in KDADs. So yeah, the $15 million is in there as well.
Okay.
Representative Landwehr.
But we're not reflecting anywhere in the numbers we're seeing the 25 million from Sparks.
It's already, if I may, Mr. Chair, it was already baked into the allocation, if you will, because it was part of the budget process last year. The money was appropriated, so it was in the KDAD's budget. It was just locked away by proviso until such time that State Finance Council released the money to be spent by the agency. So it's in the base. It doesn't show up as an enhancement because it was already in the budget last year.
I just think it would be important, Mr. Chairman, for that to be highlighted in a line item in order for us to monitor as we move forward. Because there is a lot of discussion on this issue, and there's a lot of angst and when, where, and how for us to stay on top of this. So,
if I may, Mr. Chair.
You may.
Again, it is in the budget. I understand your concern. We will have it, whatever the money is, whether it's in there today or it comes in there tomorrow, we can absolutely put it as a separate budget unit. So there's absolute focus on there. We can track it. That would absolutely be our intent to make sure we do that.
Okay, because I do know that the secretary, is having discussions, which is what she's supposed to be doing right now. We're not privy to those yet until it's ready to go public and the RFP is issued. So thank you.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Director Profit, for being here. Going back to page 22 and following up on Representative Williams' questions regarding special education, we all want to be in compliance with statutes, of course. But in education funding, there appears, based on our discussion during the special education interim, that there are some statutes that conflict. For example, the state is to fund 80% of transportation costs, yet in special education excess funding, they add districts are apparently, or some districts are adding in 100% of that cost, and then we're supposed to pay 92% of that. So in trying to really grasp what's accurate as it regards the 92%. So did you or the governor look at statutes that might be in conflict with the 92% excess cost statute in coming up with your recommendation?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Senator, for the question. The approach we took was working with the Kansas State Board of Education, as I mentioned. They're the ones that look at this, and they actually have the data, and the data is audited at the district level to see what the pure excess costs were, to see how short we were. We've used the same formula here that has been in place for the past several years to determine what our percentage of excess cost is, and we talk about that in consensus caseloads. I personally did not sit down to scour statutes to see if there is anything in conflict. As I understand it, the 92% of excess costs is controlling, if you will, and that's the mark that we need to hit. The numbers below the surface. I'd be happy to sit down and chat more about what you're seeing there, and if there's a different direction we need to take, that'd be fine as long as we're on the path to 92% and being compliant with that and pushing our federal delegation to provide more funding as well.
Appreciate that, if I may, Mr. Chair.
You may.
You have on that page bullet number 2 that says schools have pulled from operating funds to cover special education requirements. Are you aware if any funds that are generated for special education students are not being used for the purpose of special education? And if so, should that be included in the 92% of excess costs?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The way I understand it, and I admit that I've got staff that are more experts in this than I am. The way I understand it, the funds that go into the special education account are used specifically and solely, explicitly for special education costs and can't be used for anything else. And again, that's audited at the district level. The funding that we look at relies less on what is in that fund at the end of the year. I don't know that we'd look at the balance per se, but the starting point is the actual excess cost to fund special education from the prior year. and then we would work through a list of deductions from that cost to get down to what the 92% of excess cost should be. So that's really what the starting point in the process is. And it's been consistent for the past decade or so.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are you aware of the local option monies that are generated because of special education numbers that do not necessarily have to go into the special education fund that can be used for other special education purposes?
Director Profit.
I would not have the details on that myself in front of me. I assure you that our staff has that information, and I can sit down this afternoon and take a look at that.
Thank you. Final question, if I may, Mr. Chair.
You may.
Thank you. In the beginning of the section on education, the title is Continue Investing in Education. Would you just give me your definition of investing?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Absolutely. So we are stewards of the taxpayers' dollars, and the revenues that come in, we understand, are not state's dollars, but they're taxpayers' dollars. So any time that we fund a program, we're making an investment in that program and whatever the intended outcome is to be. So making investments in the education, the public education system in Kansas, ensuring that we're compliant with the Supreme Court's ruling, and also ensuring that we're investing in education for future workforce development of Kansans.
And finally, if I may.
Yes, you may.
So what should be the outcome? What should be the outcome of the governor's recommendation on the funding for special education? You mentioned there should be an outcome associated with that. If it's an investment, what should that be for the governor's recommendation on SPED funding?
Director
Thank
Profit.
you, Mr. Chair.
Is that the final question? Okay.
So the objective is to get to 92% to ensure that schools are able to fund whatever services are needed for whatever the needs are of the student in special education, to include the gifted classes. So that I can't give you a standard answer on what every student's outcome might be that's receiving special education services, because they're so disparate across the spectrum of what that student might receive. But ensuring whatever that student needs and whatever the costs are associated with that at the school district level as being funded by the state as part of our obligation with state statutes saying that we need to be at 92% of excess cost.
Representative Tarwater.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A lot of my questions have been answered already, but I do have a few more. Director, thanks for being here and thanks for your presentation. I do note that you do have some money in here for IT investments, but there's KPERS is not on there, and they're doing an RFP this year, we think, and they're planning on spending around $50 million to upgrade their system. Is that not in the budget yet?
Let me confer with my expert real quick. It could be, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, if I may. It could be that that's in the base. Let me check real quick, if you don't mind.
Representative Tarwater.
He's gonna.
All right. Thank you for allowing me to call a friend. Yes, that money is actually in the base budget. So everything that we talked about here, the large majority of what we talked about here are enhancements to the base budget. Since that was approved previously, we actually allocated those funds to them in the base budget, so it is covered.
Okay, thank you. And then on the water fund, you have a $29 million interest savings. Are you assuming that the $2 million a year or $2.5 million a year will continue to be paid when you come up with that $29 million? Or is that if we did not make any payments until the balloon payment was due?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the question. I will have to circle back with you. I don't have the actual amortization schedule from the water office. I know they have an amortization schedule. This was provided to us by them that said if we pay it today, this will be the balance due. If we wait until the due date, this will be the balance due. So I will commit to you that by the end of the week, I'll get the amortization schedule to you.
Representative Tarwater.
Okay, so following up kind of on what Representative Sutton was talking about earlier, if we were to take that $53 million and put it into KPERS per se, we would make a lot more than the 2.6%. In fact, we would make enough to pay the $2 million a year that they're currently paying and then some. And I didn't see anywhere in here that the governor is looking to pay down KPERS anymore like we did last year. But if we put $1 billion, for every $1 billion that we put into KPERS, we lower our budget going forward $70 million a year. And so I think if we're going to look at paying off debt, we need to start where we're going to save the most. Did you all consider paying down Capers a balloon payment?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. There was no consideration of depositing additional funds into the CAPER system, and that's for a couple of reasons. The funding that the governor proposed last year was the $253.8 million. Those were to catch up for the skipped payments, so that was above and beyond the UAL, the unfunded actuarial liability. By the end of session, obviously she signed the bill that was put together by the legislature to deposit $1.125 billion into CAPERS. That entire deposit has been complete. If you look at the current amortization schedules, and I'm getting over my skis here, but Director Conroy can give you all the details. If you look at the amortization schedule and what the valuation was at the end of last year, there was a step back, if you will, in terms of the funded ratio when they reduced the assumed rate of return from 7.75 to 7%. To offset the impact of the state budget, they re-amortized by, I think, between 7 and 11 years to kind of help the state. When you look at their projections over the next several years, they get back to 80% funded relatively quickly, and we have a definite end date in mind. So if we just stay on the path of continuing our deposits into CAPERS as we have been, we should be on a very nice path to getting that paid down.
Representative Tarwater.
Okay, thanks for that answer. On higher education, you say the goal is to continue recent trend of no to low tuition increases. Do you have some sort of an agreement made with our state schools? And what is the governor's thought on freezing the increases? Some of them have gone over 4 years without an increase at all.
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. There is no proviso language this year to freeze tuition rates. So we had that in there last year. It was a substantially greater investment. I think it was $45.7 million that we put there. And we were told at the time that that would get them solid on freezing tuition. We did not have the conversation about locking them into a tuition freeze. We did have conversations about, what tuition looks like and what these fundings are. That's really where that $21.8 million to kind of mitigate the cost of inflation comes in. If we can offset some of those cost increases, they can have a more stable, I'm not going to commit them to a number, but trying to keep the tuition increases as low as possible. But there's no mandate to freeze tuition.
So you did have conversations with the universities, and this would be enough for that?
Director Profit.
Again, I'm not going to commit them to freezing tuition. We feel that this puts them in a position to have modest increases, if any, but certainly up to the institutions.
Representative Tarwater.
Okay, thanks. And my final question is the veterans home you chose Topeka to build it in when I thought that we were targeting Northeast Kansas for that. How did that change?
Director Profit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was not a part of that process, but I do know that Shawnee County falls in the demographic definition of Northeast Kansas, and so it qualifies under that definition.
Correct. I was just going to say the same thing. They were actually in that area. Shawnee County was also included in there. Representative Ballard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I can make this quicker because many of my questions have been asked. I'll start with the veterans home, but I got the response to the answer for that. Conflicting opinions about the special ed, and I think I got most of the answer for that. But I would welcome the opportunity for a bigger discussion on that 92% of special ed, because most districts have reported they do not receive 92%. And I think that's something we need to get settled about. How much do we actually apply, and what other monies do we have that creates that problem? So I would welcome that. The mental health beds, I think, was covered pretty much, but I would just like to make a comment about the youth psychiatric residential beds, because there seems to be a greater need in the state to make sure that the youth or the residential beds are being taken care of. And we haven't really done that. I didn't hear much about human services in terms of acknowledging from social services budget. I have to say, the recommendations for human services hopefully will answer so many of the testimonies and the questions and requests that we have received in that budget. And for that, I am very pleased. And I'm sure Representative Carpenter would be, and Representative Mason had to leave. So I'm articulating that because we get those kind of requests every year about it. And I see where the governor and his staff have addressed some of those. And for that, I am very pleased. So thank you.
Representative Estes.
Thank you. Director, you said that the special ed money and how it's used is audited at the district level. Do you know who's doing that audit? Do you know where that information is stored? And are all those audits collected in one place and readily available to the public?
Director Profit.
I do, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative, for the question. I do not have the answer to that question in front of me, but as with everybody else, I will commit to finding that and getting you an answer by the end of this week.
Representative Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Profit, could you elaborate a little bit more about the expansion of financial aid for the state's public universities? Do you mean that narrowed just to the 6 regent universities, or does that speak to technical colleges, junior colleges, private institutions?
Director Profit.
Thank you for the question. I believe, and I will follow up on this if I'm wrong, but I believe that it's for the 6 Regents universities.
Are there any further questions for Director Profit? Because actually I was contacted by the governor's office and they said they had hired a band to basically, like in the Oscars, have you exit, but we kept you here a little bit longer for the question, so I apologize. All right, see no more questions. Thank you, Director Profit, for being here. And then if you could, with any follow-up information, please relay that to the Appropriations and the Ways and Means Committee.
Yes, sir.
On any questions that were not answered this morning, and you would follow up with the respective committees. All right, with that, committee, we are adjourned.